A routine flight from Newark to Geneva becomes a stage for an explosive confrontation. When a senior flight attendant, fueled by prejudice, deliberately throws away a black woman's first-class boarding pass, she expects tears or a scene. She doesn't expect the quiet, chilling smile that follows. She doesn't expect the woman to calmly reach into her briefcase and pull out a credential that can ground entire fleets and end careers in an instant. This isn't just a story about racism at 30,000 feet. It's the story of what happens when a petty tyrant messes with a federal officer who holds the power of the sky in her hands. Stay tuned to witness the moment a simple piece of paper is replaced by a badge that unleashes a firestorm of consequences, proving that karma sometimes holds a pilot's license. The air in Newark Liberty International Airport's Terminal C hummed with a familiar, chaotic symphony. It was a sound Dr. Annalise Sterling knew well, the rolling thunder of suitcases on polished floors, the staccato announcements of gate changes, the multilingual murmurs of thousands of lives temporarily intersecting. For Annalise, it was the sound of purpose. Travel was the lifeblood of her profession, the necessary inconvenience that allowed her to ensure the very safety of the systems humming around her. She sat in the Polaris Lounge, a haven of muted lighting and complimentary champagne, a stark contrast to the terminal's frenetic energy. Her leather briefcase, worn at the corners from countless trips, rested by her feet. Inside, alongside her laptop and noise-canceling headphones, were the meticulously prepared notes for her keynote address at the International Civil Aviation Organization's annual symposium in Geneva. The topic, Next Generation Avionics, Mitigating Human Factor Risks in Automated Cockpits. It was her life's work, a culmination of a doctorate in aerospace engineering from MIT and a decade of field experience as an aviation safety inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration. Annalise was a woman defined by precision. It was in the crisp crease of her charcoal gray trousers, the understated elegance of her silk blouse, and the methodical way she arranged her documents on the small table before her. Her hair was styled in neat professional locks, pulled back from a face that conveyed both deep intelligence and a serene patience. A patience honed by years of navigating bureaucratic labyrinths and de-escalating tense situations on tarmacs and in hangars. This trip, however, held a dual purpose. After the 5-day conference in Geneva, she would take a train to a quiet town in the Swiss Alps to visit her father, a retired history professor who had chosen a life of books and mountain air over the bustle of his native Boston. His health was declining, a slow, gentle fading that made these biannual visits both precious and poignant. The thought of him brought a soft warmth to her chest, a quiet counterpoint to the analytical rigor of her professional life. She glanced at her watch, a classic timepiece, a gift from her father when she'd earned her PhD. Boarding for Transatlantic Airways Flight 88 would begin in 40 minutes. She finished her sparkling water, packed her notes with the same precision she'd unpacked them, and stood. The lounge was an ecosystem of privilege. Men in expensive suits talked loudly into their phones, closing deals across continents. A young couple, likely on their honeymoon, took selfies with champagne flutes. Annalise, a black woman in her late 30s, moved through the space with an air of quiet confidence that drew a few curious, though not unfriendly, glances. She was accustomed to being an anomaly in these spaces, a fact she neither courted nor shied away from. Her credentials spoke for themselves, and she had long ago stopped feeling the need to justify her presence. As she approached Gate C-123, the pre-boarding scrum was already forming. The usual casts of air travel were assembling. The anxious families in economy, the self-important business travelers in Premium Plus, and the serene, seasoned occupants of first and business class who knew their seats were in no danger of being given away. Annalise took her place in the designated Group 1 lane, her first-class ticket and passport held neatly in her hand. The gate agent, a young man named Kevin with a name tag that sat askew on his ill-fitting uniform, was typing furiously into his computer. He seemed flustered, his brow furrowed in concentration. When Annalise reached the front of the line, she offered a polite smile and handed him her documents. He scanned her passport, then looked at the ticket, then back at his screen. He frowned. "Dr. Annalise Sterling?" he asked, his tone laced with an almost imperceptible note of skepticism. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her voice even. He typed some more, the clacking of the keys unnecessarily loud. It's just unusual. This seat was booked with a corporate account, a government rate. Annalise's smile didn't waver, but her eyes held a new firmness. That's correct. It is. She offered no further explanation. It was not required. The ticket was valid, her identity was confirmed, and the reason for the fare class was a matter between her employer and the airline. Kevin seemed to deflate slightly, realizing he had no grounds to stand on. But instead of simply proceeding, he held her boarding pass for a moment too long, his thumb rubbing over the first-class designation as if trying to smudge it away. It was a small gesture, a microaggression so subtle that to call it out would have made her seem hypersensitive. It was a test, a silent challenge to her belonging. Annalise had faced this test 1,000 times. She met his gaze with unwavering calm until he finally, reluctantly, scanned the pass and handed it back. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," he said, the honorific sounding more like an afterthought than a sign of respect. "I will," Annalise said, her tone leaving no doubt. She walked down the jet bridge, the slight friction with Kevin already receding in her mind. It was just background noise, the static of a world still catching up. She was focused on the journey ahead, on her speech, on the intricate dance of international aviation policy, and on the simple, profound joy of seeing her father again. She had no idea that the gate agent was merely the opening act, a faint tremor before the earthquake that was about to rupture her meticulously ordered world. Waiting for her at the aircraft door was a woman who would turn a routine flight into the crucible of her career. The transition from the sterile gray of the jet bridge to the soft, ambient lighting of the Transatlantic Airways Boeing 787 Dreamliner cabin was usually a welcome one. Annalise stepped aboard, her eyes quickly adjusting. The first-class cabin was arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, creating private pods for each passenger. It was designed for comfort and anonymity, a quiet sanctuary before the long haul across the ocean. Standing at the entrance, seemingly guarding it rather than welcoming passengers into it, was a senior flight attendant. Her name tag read Brenda. She was a woman in her early 50s, with a severe blonde bob that looked as though it had been lacquered into place and a thin, unsmiling line for a mouth. Her posture was rigid, her eyes sweeping over each passenger with a look of intense scrutiny, as if she were a drill sergeant inspecting her troops. Annalise approached, holding her boarding pass. "Good evening," she said, her voice pleasant. Brenda's eyes flickered from Annalise's face down to the ticket in her hand, then back up again. The appraisal was swift, cold, and dismissive. She didn't return the greeting. Instead, she said, her voice sharp and loud enough for the passengers already seated to hear, "Boarding pass and passport." It was a standard request, but the tone was anything but. It was a demand, an accusation. Annalise complied without a word, handing over the documents Kevin had just inspected moments before. Brenda took them, her movements clipped and impatient. She stared at the passport photo, then at Annalise's face, her gaze lingering for an uncomfortably long moment. "You're in 2A, Brenda stated, not as a helpful direction, but as if pointing out a statistical anomaly. She handed the passport back but held onto the boarding pass. "Thank you," Annalise said, reaching for the paper slip. Brenda pulled it back slightly, out of her reach. A flicker of something ugly, a cocktail of resentment and suspicion, danced in her eyes. "This is a very expensive seat," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more insulting than her earlier shout. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was so brazen, so openly prejudiced, that for a split second, Annalise felt a jolt of pure disbelief. Around them, the delicate social contract of the airplane cabin, the polite ignoring of one's fellow travelers, was momentarily broken. The man in seat 3D, a businessman in a crisp suit, lowered his newspaper. A young woman across the aisle paused her phone call, her eyes wide. Annalise felt a familiar, cold fire ignite in her stomach, but her training, her entire professional life, was about maintaining composure under pressure. An emotional reaction was what Brenda wanted. It would validate her prejudice, allowing her to paint Annalise as the angry black woman, the one causing a disturbance. Annalise would not give her that satisfaction. She met Brenda's hostile gaze with an expression of serene, unassailable calm. "Yes," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as Riverstone. "I'm quite sure. It says 2A right there." Brenda's lips tightened. She had expected a protest, an argument, some kind of emotional outburst. Annalise's composure seemed to infuriate her more than any angry retort could have. "We've had issues," Brenda continued, her voice rising again, manufacturing a justification for her behavior. "People using fraudulent documents or trying to sneak into premium cabins. We have to be extra careful. Security is our top priority." The implication was clear. Annalise was a potential fraud, a security risk. The businessman in 3D now looked openly uncomfortable, shaking his head slightly in disgust. "I can assure you," Annalise said, still holding Brenda's gaze, "my documents are in order. I was just cleared at the gate. May I have my boarding pass so I can take my seat?" The simple, polite request was a direct challenge to Brenda's manufactured authority. For a moment, the flight attendant seemed to be at a loss. She was holding a valid ticket belonging to the passenger standing in front of her, with no legitimate reason to withhold it. But backing down now would be an admission of her own bigotry. So she doubled down. In a swift, shocking movement, Brenda Jenkins did something that defied all protocol, all decency. She looked directly at Annalise, a sneer twisting her lips, and crumpled the boarding pass in her fist. The crinkling sound of the paper was unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she turned and tossed the balled-up paper into a small rubbish bin used for collecting trash during boarding. "Oops," Brenda said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Looks like you've misplaced your boarding pass. Without it, I can't let you on the aircraft. You'll have to go back to the gate and have them print you a new one." She gestured vaguely back towards the jet bridge. "You should probably hurry. We're closing the doors in a few minutes." A collective gasp went through the few passengers who had witnessed the exchange. It was an act of such petty, vindictive power that it was almost surreal. Brenda had not just disrespected a passenger, she had deliberately attempted to disenfranchise her, to deny her a seat she had paid for, based on nothing more than the color of her skin. She had weaponized her uniform and her position to humiliate and inconvenience Annalise. Brenda stood with her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant look on her face. She had won. She had put this woman, who didn't look like she belonged in first class, back in her place. She expected pleading, anger, perhaps even tears. She got none of it. Annalise Sterling did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not look flustered in the slightest. Instead, a slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. It was not a smile of amusement or happiness. It was a smile of profound, chilling clarity. It was the smile of a chess master who has just seen her opponent walk into a trap that will cost them the entire game. The smile completely unnerved Brenda. "What are you smiling at?" she snapped. "Go on, get off the plane before you delay the flight for everyone." Annalise's smile remained. She slowly, deliberately placed her carry-on bag on the floor. She did not look toward the jet bridge. She did not look at Brenda with anger. She looked at her with an expression of clinical pity, as if observing a specimen that had just made a fatal error. "That won't be necessary," Annalise said, her voice dropping to a calm, authoritative tenor that cut through the cabin's tension. "But what is necessary right now is for you to give me your full name and your employee identification number." The game had just changed, and Brenda Jenkins had absolutely no idea the world of trouble she had just invited through the airplane door. Brenda's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then annoyance. The passenger wasn't behaving as expected. She wasn't scurrying away in defeat. She was issuing a demand. "I don't have to give you anything," Brenda scoffed, recovering her bluster. "I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. You are a passenger without a boarding pass. Now, for the last time, please exit the aircraft, or I will have security remove you." The threat was meant to be the final, crushing blow, but Annalise didn't even blink. Her calm smile was gone, replaced by an expression of gravitas and unyielding authority. Her voice when she spoke again had a new, steely edge. It was the voice she used when speaking to non-compliant airline executives or stubborn maintenance chiefs. It was a voice that did not brook argument. "Actually, you do," Annalise stated, enunciating each word with surgical precision. "Under the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 14, Part 121, airline personnel are required to identify themselves to passengers upon request during the execution of their duties. Your refusal to do so is a violation." The mention of the specific CFR title was like a bucket of ice water. This was not the language of a disgruntled tourist. This was the language of law, of regulation, of the industry itself. Brenda's face went from smug to uncertain. The businessman in 3D, who had been watching intently, suddenly sat up straighter, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. I don't know what you're talking about," Brenda stammered, her confidence beginning to visibly crumble. "You're not making any sense. Just get off the plane." Annalise ignored her plea. "I will ask you one more time," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Your name and your employee number. Do not make this worse for yourself." Panic began to set in Brenda's eyes. She had miscalculated horribly. This woman was not who she thought she was, but her pride, her stubborn refusal to admit she was wrong, kept her locked in place. "I'm not telling you anything. Get security," she yelled toward the cockpit door, her voice cracking with a mixture of anger and fear. Annalise simply shook her head, a sigh of disappointment escaping her lips. "Very well," she said softly. "You've made your choice." With a slow, deliberate grace that commanded the attention of everyone in the cabin, Annalise turned to the briefcase resting at her feet. She knelt slightly, clicked open the brass latches, and pushed aside the files for her Geneva presentation. Her hand retrieved a slim, black leather wallet. It was not a personal wallet. It was larger, more official. She stood up, holding the wallet in her left hand. The silence in the cabin was now absolute, thick with anticipation. Even the flight attendant, who had been working in the galley, had crept forward to see what the commotion was about. Annalise did not flip the wallet open with a dramatic flourish. She opened it with the quiet reverence of a priest opening a holy text. Inside, on one side, was a photo ID card. On the other, nestled in a custom-cut recess, was a gleaming gold and silver badge. The eagle at the top seemed to catch the cabin light, its wings spread wide. The seal of the Department of Transportation was prominent in the center, and below it, in bold, unmistakable letters, were the words, Federal Aviation Administration. Annalise held it up for Brenda to see clearly. The flight attendant's eyes widened, her face draining of all color. She looked as though she had seen a ghost. "My name," Annalise said, her voice resonating with the full weight of the authority she now displayed, "is Dr. Annalise Sterling. I am an aviation safety inspector with the United States Federal Aviation Administration." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting the full gravity of the situation crash down upon the stunned flight attendant. "And you, Ms. Jenkins," Annalise continued, her gaze as sharp and penetrating as a laser, "are now the subject of an official investigation. The charges as of this moment include interference with the duties of a federal officer in the course of their travel, which is a felony, willful passenger disenfranchisement, and failure to comply with federally mandated crew member identification protocols. Your decision to destroy my boarding pass, a legally required travel document, will be noted as an intentional act of obstruction." She tilted the badge slightly so the other crew members and passengers could see. "This aircraft is now under temporary FAA jurisdiction. Nobody is to close the main cabin door. Nobody is to communicate with the ground crew without my express permission. Captain Miller is to present himself in the cabin immediately." Brenda Jenkins stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, her carefully constructed world of petty tyranny shattering into a million pieces. The crumpled boarding pass in the rubbish bin was no longer just a piece of trash. It was Exhibit A in a federal case. The woman she had tried to humiliate was not just a passenger. She was the FAA. She was the very authority that granted Brenda the license to fly, the authority that could, with the stroke of a pen, take it all away. The businessman in 3D let out a low whistle. The young woman across the aisle slowly lifted her phone, discreetly hitting the record button. Annalise lowered her badge but did not put it away. She held it at her side, a symbol of the profound and irreversible shift in power that had just occurred. The gatekeeper had just found herself locked outside the gates of her own career, and the woman she had tried to cast out now held the only key. The immediate aftermath of Annalise's revelation was not chaos, but a stunned, profound silence. The air in the first-class cabin crackled with a new kind of tension, no longer one of social discomfort, but of regulatory gravity. Brenda Jenkins remained rooted to the spot, her face a mask of disbelief rapidly morphing into sheer terror. The color had not returned. She looked pale and brittle, as if a strong gust of wind might shatter her. The first person to move was the other flight attendant, a younger woman named Maria, who had been watching from the galley. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and perhaps a touch of awe. She took one look at the FAA badge, at Annalise's implacable expression, and at her senior colleague's frozen state, and made a swift, career-preserving decision. She hurried toward the cockpit, her steps quick and quiet. Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Robert Miller emerged, followed by his first officer. Captain Miller was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 50s, with a calm, authoritative demeanor that came from decades of commanding multi-million-dollar aircraft. He had the weary but alert eyes of a man who understood responsibility in its starkest terms. His gaze swept the cabin, taking in Brenda's ashen face, the passengers craning their necks, and finally settling on Annalise, who stood with an air of unshakable professionalism. "I'm Captain Miller," he said, his voice a steady baritone. "There seems to be a situation here." Annalise met his gaze directly. "Captain, I am Inspector Annalise Sterling, FAA," she said, presenting her credentials again for his inspection. "There is indeed a situation." Captain Miller's eyes focused on the badge, and his entire demeanor shifted. The casual authority of a pilot became the focused deference of a regulated professional addressing a federal regulator. He knew exactly what that badge signified. It meant rules had been broken. It meant his flight, his crew, and his airline were now under a microscope. "Inspector Sterling," he said, his tone now formal and serious. "I understand. What has happened?" Before Annalise could reply, Brenda finally found her voice, a desperate, panicked squeak. "Captain, it's a misunderstanding. This woman, she didn't have her boarding pass, and I was just following procedure." "That is false," Annalise interrupted, her voice cutting through Brenda's frantic explanation with chilling precision. "Captain, your senior flight attendant, whose name I had to demand under threat of regulatory citation, is Brenda Jenkins. Upon my boarding, she questioned my presence in this cabin, confiscated my valid first-class boarding pass, and then deliberately destroyed it by crumpling it and throwing it into that bin." Annalise gestured towards the rubbish bin without breaking eye contact with the captain. "She then ordered me off the aircraft and threatened to have me removed by security when I refused." Captain Miller's gaze shifted to Brenda, and his expression hardened. "Brenda, is this true?" "No, I mean, she lost it, and I was just cleaning up. It was an accident," Brenda stammered, her lies becoming more tangled and pathetic with each word. The businessman in seat 3D, who had been listening to the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Excuse me, Captain," he said, his voice clear and firm. "I saw the whole thing. That is not what happened. Your flight attendant was hostile to this lady from the moment she stepped on board. She threw that boarding pass away on purpose. It was a disgusting display." Several other passengers murmured in agreement. The young woman who was recording discreetly angled her phone to ensure she captured the captain's reaction. The weight of witness testimony, combined with Annalise's unimpeachable status, was overwhelming. Captain Miller's face was now grim. He looked at the rubbish bin, then back at Brenda. The thin veneer of professionalism he maintained could not hide the fury in his eyes. A flight attendant's primary job, beyond service, was safety and security. Brenda had not only failed at basic human decency, but she had created a security incident through her own prejudice, and in doing so, had brought federal scrutiny down on his command. Just then, the gate agent, Kevin, appeared at the door of the aircraft, his face etched with worry. "Captain, the door is still open. Is there a delay?" He saw Annalise, then Brenda, and his face went even paler as he realized the small friction at the gate had escalated into a full-blown catastrophe. "There is," Captain Miller said, his voice tight. "Get David Chen on the horn. Tell him to get to this gate immediately. Inform him we have an FAA inspector on board and a Code 7 situation." Code 7 was airline jargon for a serious security or regulatory breach. Kevin's eyes widened in panic, and he scurried away from the door without another word. Captain Miller then turned back to Annalise. "Inspector, my apologies for the conduct of my crew member. This is unacceptable. What do you require?" "For now, Captain," Annalise said, her voice returning to a calm, procedural tone, "this aircraft is to remain at the gate with the door open. Ms. Jenkins is to be immediately removed from duty. She is not to interact with any other passengers or crew, and she is not to leave the vicinity of this gate. She is the subject of a federal inquiry, and I will need to take her statement, as well as the statements of any witnesses." She then looked directly at the crumbling Brenda. "You will surrender your airline crew ID badge to the captain now." Tears began to well in Brenda's eyes as the full, irreversible reality of her actions crashed down on her. This was not a slap on the wrist. This was the end of her career. With a trembling hand, she unclipped the ID from her uniform and handed it to Captain Miller, avoiding his disgusted gaze. The power dynamic had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The woman who held all the power just 10 minutes ago was now stripped of her credentials, standing in disgrace. The woman she had tried to eject was now in command of the entire situation, her authority absolute and unquestioned. The ground had fundamentally shifted beneath everyone's feet, and the shock waves were just beginning to spread. David Chen, the Transatlantic Airways station manager for Newark, arrived at the gate looking harried and stressed. He was a man accustomed to logistical nightmares, cancellations, delays, overbooked flights. But a Code 7 involving a present FAA inspector was a different level of crisis. It was the kind of thing that got people fired, from the ground up to the executive level. He boarded the aircraft and was met by the grim sight of Captain Miller standing with Annalise, while a tearful, shattered-looking Brenda Jenkins stood off to the side, isolated by a palpable aura of disgrace. "Captain Miller, Mr. Chen," Annalise said, acknowledging the new arrival with a professional nod. Her credentials were still in her hand. "I am Inspector Sterling." Chen's face paled. "Inspector, I am so sorry. I was just made aware. Please, whatever the issue is, we will rectify it immediately." "The issue," Annalise stated, leaving no room for corporate platitudes, "is that your senior flight attendant, Ms. Jenkins, committed multiple federal violations, including passenger interference and destruction of a travel document, in what appears to be a targeted act of discrimination. This is no longer just an airline customer service issue. It's an FAA matter now." She calmly and methodically recounted the events, from Brenda's initial accusatory tone to the deliberate act of crumpling and discarding the boarding pass. Her account was precise, unemotional, and devastatingly credible. She concluded, "I will be filing a formal report, and I will require the airline's full cooperation. That begins with securing the testimony of Ms. Jenkins and the other witnesses." David Chen looked at Brenda, his expression a mixture of fury and despair. She was a PR and legal liability of immense proportions. "Brenda," he said, his voice dangerously low, "is this true?" Brenda opened her mouth perhaps to offer one last, desperate lie, but she looked at Annalise's steady gaze, at the captain's stony face, at the passenger in 3D who was watching her with undisguised contempt, and she broke. A sob escaped her lips. I was just having a bad day," she whimpered. "I didn't mean... I thought..." "You thought what?" Annalise pressed, her voice quiet but insistent. "That my presence in first class was an error? That a black woman couldn't possibly belong there without some form of subterfuge? Let's be very clear about the nature of this misunderstanding." Brenda had no answer. She simply shook her head, tears streaming down her face, a pathetic figure whose ugly prejudice had finally backed her into a corner from which there was no escape. "Mr. Chen," Annalise continued, turning her attention back to the manager, "Ms. Jenkins is officially suspended, pending the outcome of my investigation and your own. I want her escorted off the aircraft and held in your office until I can take her formal statement. She is not to have contact with her union representative until after she has given her initial, unimpeded account to me. Is that understood? Yes, Inspector, absolutely, Chen said, nodding quickly. He gestured to another gate agent who had followed him. Please escort Ms. Jenkins to my office. Now. The public humiliation of Brenda Jenkins was complete. No longer a figure of authority, she was led down the jet bridge like a reprimanded child, her head bowed in shame, the sound of her own quiet sobs the only sound she made. The other passengers watched her go, their expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction. With Brenda removed, Annalise turned her attention to the practicalities of her investigation. Captain, I will need the names and contact information of the witnesses in the cabin who saw the event. I will also need to retrieve the evidence. She walked over to the rubbish bin and, using a pen to avoid touching it directly, fished out the tightly crumpled ball of paper. She carefully uncrumpled it. There it was, her name, the flight number, and the bold letters, Seat 2A. She placed the document in a clear plastic sleeve from her briefcase. It was now evidence. While the captain and his first officer collected names from the willing passengers, Annalise stepped into the galley to make a call. She dialed the number for her direct superior, Director Peterson, at the FAA's Eastern Region headquarters. Peterson, a gravelly voice answered on the first ring. Director, it's Sterling, she said. Annalise, you should be in the air by now. Everything all right? Negative, sir. I'm still on the ground at Newark. I've had to open an official inquiry on site. Transatlantic Airways, Flight 88. She gave him a concise, professional summary of the incident. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Director Peterson spoke again, his voice was cold with anger. A flight attendant did what? To an FAA inspector on official travel? Sterling, you have my full backing. Take whatever action you deem necessary. I want a full report from the airline on my desk by morning, outlining their immediate corrective measures. I'll have our legal team on standby. Let them know that we will be pursuing this to the fullest extent. This isn't just an insult to you, it's an attack on the integrity of this administration. Understood, sir, Annalise replied. And Annalise, Peterson added, his voice softening slightly, are you okay? The simple question momentarily caught her off guard. In the heat of the professional moment, she hadn't stopped to consider the personal one. The humiliation, the anger, the sheer exhaustion of having to constantly navigate such prejudice. I'm fine, sir, she said, her voice steady. Just doing my job. She ended the call, her resolve hardened. This was no longer just about Brenda Jenkins. It was about the systemic issues that allowed a woman like her to feel so empowered in her bigotry. The unraveling had just begun, and it would not stop with one disgraced flight attendant. It would reach the very heart of the airline that had created her. The hours that followed were a blur of meticulous, professional activity for Annalise. Flight 88 was, of course, significantly delayed. A new senior flight attendant had to be called in, and the entire crew had to be debriefed. Annalise, meanwhile, conducted her inquiry with the dispassionate focus of a seasoned investigator. She took statements, first from the businessman in 3D, a corporate lawyer named Robert Finley, who was more than happy to provide a detailed, damning account. Then from the young woman, a journalism student named Olivia, who had not only witnessed the event, but had also recorded the immediate aftermath. She willingly airdropped the video file to Annalise for her report. Her final interview was with Brenda Jenkins, conducted in David Chen's glass-walled office overlooking the tarmac. Brenda was a completely different person from the imperious gatekeeper on the plane. She was red-eyed, trembling, and stripped of all her former arrogance. She confessed everything, her words punctuated by sobs and pathetic pleas for forgiveness. She claimed it was an out-of-character lapse in judgment, a result of personal stress. Annalise listened patiently, taking notes. She did not offer sympathy. Ms. Jenkins, she said when Brenda had finished, her voice even, your personal stress does not explain the targeted nature of your actions. It does not explain why you saw me, and specifically me, as someone who didn't belong. This wasn't a random lapse. It was a choice, and now you must face the consequences of that choice. The consequences were swift, severe, and cascaded through every level of Transatlantic Airways. The hard karma Brenda had invited upon herself was just beginning to hit. First, there was the immediate termination. David Chen, under immense pressure from corporate headquarters, who had been alerted by a frantic call from the Newark station and a very direct call from FAA Director Peterson, fired Brenda before Annalise had even left the airport. Her 2 decades of service were rendered meaningless. She was escorted out of the building, her career in aviation over. But the airline's action was just the beginning. The FAA's involvement elevated the consequences from a corporate HR matter to a federal regulatory one. Based on Annalise's comprehensive report, which included the witness statements and the video evidence, the FAA formally launched a full investigation not just into Brenda Jenkins, but into Transatlantic Airways' hiring, training, and oversight practices. The FAA legal department came down hard. Brenda Jenkins was personally charged with interfering with a federal officer, a serious offense. More critically, they initiated proceedings to permanently revoke her flight attendant certification. This meant she could never work as a flight attendant for any U.S.-based or affiliated airline ever again. The license she had worked for years to obtain was gone forever. On top of that, she was hit with a personal civil penalty, a fine of several $1,000s for her multiple violations. The ripple effect then slammed into the airline. Transatlantic Airways was found to be at fault for fostering an environment where such behavior could occur. Annalise's investigation, spurred by the incident, prompted a deeper look into the airline's complaint records. They uncovered a pattern. Several prior, less dramatic complaints had been lodged against Brenda Jenkins for rude and dismissive behavior, disproportionately from minority passengers. These had been internally dismissed with a simple warning. Now, in the harsh light of a federal inquiry, they formed a damning portrait of negligence. The FAA levied a staggering fine against Transatlantic Airways, a figure in the high 6 figures, for failing to adequately address a pattern of discriminatory behavior and for the flagrant violations committed on Flight 88. But the financial penalty was only part of it. The airline was placed under a consent decree. They were mandated, at their own expense, to hire an independent diversity and inclusion consultancy to completely overhaul their employee training programs. This new training, focusing on unconscious bias, de-escalation, and cultural sensitivity, would be mandatory for every single employee, from the baggage handlers to the CEO. And the FAA would have direct oversight, with Annalise Sterling's department tasked with auditing its implementation. The story inevitably leaked. The journalism student, Olivia, wrote a detailed account for her university paper, which was then picked up by national news outlets. The video she had taken went viral. Transatlantic Airways was engulfed in a PR nightmare, forced to issue multiple public apologies. Their stock price dipped. The incident on Flight 88 became a case study in business schools and aviation training academies on the catastrophic cost of prejudice. As for Annalise, she was put on a different flight to Geneva several hours later. The airline, in a desperate attempt at appeasement, had rebooked her into their most exclusive Global First suite. The new flight crew treated her with a level of deference bordering on fear. The captain came out personally to apologize before takeoff. Every flight attendant knew her name, her title, and her story. They offered her champagne, gourmet meals, and anything else she could possibly desire. Annalise accepted their professional service politely but remained detached. She didn't want their champagne. She wanted them to do their jobs without prejudice. As the plane finally lifted off from the runway at Newark, leaving the chaos of the day behind, she looked out the window at the sprawling lights of the city below. The hard karma had been delivered, not through an act of personal revenge, but through the dispassionate, methodical application of the rules. Brenda Jenkins had tried to make Annalise small, to erase her. Instead, she had magnified her, turning her into an instrument of profound and necessary change. The flight across the Atlantic was a study in contrasts. On the one hand, Annalise was encased in the quiet, climate-controlled luxury of the Global First suite, a private pod with a lie-flat bed, a personal minibar, and a large screen for entertainment. On the other, her mind was a turbulent airspace of thoughts and emotions, replaying the day's jarring events. The new flight crew, a team clearly handpicked by a frantic station manager, was a model of solicitous professionalism. They were so attentive, so eager to please, that it bordered on nervous reverence. The senior flight attendant who replaced Brenda, a kind-faced woman named Susan, approached Annalise shortly after takeoff. "Dr. Sterling," she began, her voice low and sincere, "I just want to say on behalf of the entire crew, we are deeply sorry for what you experienced today. It was unprofessional, unacceptable, and it does not represent who we are or the standards we strive to uphold." Annalise looked up from the folder she'd been reviewing. She saw genuine regret in the woman's eyes, not just corporate-mandated damage control. "Thank you, Susan," she replied, her tone appreciative but firm. "I know this was the action of one individual, but it's the systems that allow such individuals to operate unchecked that are the real problem." "We understand," Susan said with a nod, "and I have a feeling things are about to change. Drastically." The captain also made a point of coming back from the cockpit to speak with her personally, echoing Susan's sentiments and assuring her that the incident was already being discussed at the highest levels of the airline's operations division. He spoke of his own shame that such a thing could happen under his command. Annalise accepted their apologies with grace, understanding they were also professionals caught in the fallout of their colleagues' disastrous choices. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, a quiet blanket of darkness enveloping the world outside, Annalise finally allowed herself to decompress. The adrenaline of the confrontation and the methodical focus of the investigation gave way to a quiet, weary introspection. She hadn't sought this battle, but when it came to her, she had met it with the full force of her training and authority. She felt a grim satisfaction, not in Brenda's ruin, but in the reaffirmation of order. A system, however flawed, had been activated to correct a grievous error. She thought of Brenda Jenkins, not with malice, but with a kind of clinical sadness. She saw a woman so consumed by her own bitterness and prejudice that she had turned her uniform, a symbol of safety and service, into a weapon of hate. In doing so, she had self-destructed, becoming a casualty of her own poisoned worldview. Then the true weight of the day settled upon her. The deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that came from having to fight a battle she shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. The frustration of needing a federal badge to be granted the basic dignity and respect that should have been her right as a human being. A quiet anger simmered beneath her calm exterior, not the hot, explosive anger Brenda had tried to provoke, but a slow-burning, deep-seated anger at the persistence of it all. For a moment, she let herself feel the sting of the humiliation, the sheer audacity of being told she didn't belong in a space she had earned 10 times over. Her mind drifted to the core of her work, the human factor she was scheduled to speak about in Geneva. This incident was a textbook, if unconventional, example. A flight crew's primary duty is to ensure the safety of all passengers. A flight attendant who allows personal bias to dictate their actions is a compromised safety asset. What if the person they chose to discriminate against was a federal air marshal trying to be discreet? What if their prejudice caused them to ignore a passenger pointing out a legitimate security concern, like the smell of smoke or a strange noise from the wing? Brenda's actions were not just an insult, they were a safety breach. They revealed a flaw in the human component of the aviation system, and it was Annalise's job to identify and correct such flaws. This incident had given her a raw, powerful new anecdote for her presentation. She arrived in Geneva to a crisp, clear morning. The air was clean, the city immaculate. When she checked into her hotel, a message was waiting for her from the CEO of Transatlantic Airways, offering another profuse apology and assurances of sweeping internal reforms. She read it, filed it away, and turned her focus to the two reasons she had come. Her keynote address at the ICAO symposium was a resounding success. The room was packed with aviation experts from around the globe. She spoke with passion and precision about the complex interface between pilots and increasingly automated systems. But when she reached the section on the human factor, she paused. Technology can solve for mechanical failure, for navigational errors, for fuel efficiency, she said, her voice resonating through the auditorium. But it cannot solve for a failure of character. It cannot code out prejudice. The single most important safety feature on any aircraft is a well-trained, impartial, and professional crew. When that feature is compromised by personal bias, the entire system is at risk. Integrity is not a soft skill in our profession. It is a core competency as vital as the ability to read a checklist or fly on instruments. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Several attendees who had already seen the news reports of the Newark incident, now circulating online, understood the powerful personal conviction behind her words. After her speech, she was approached by colleagues, engineers, regulators, and airline executives from other companies who praised her courage both on the stage and on the tarmac. After the conference, she took the train into the mountains. The journey was a balm, the scenery shifting from urban sophistication to breathtaking alpine grandeur. When she arrived at her father's small, book-filled chalet, he was waiting for her on the porch, a plaid blanket over his legs. He looked frailer than on her last visit, but his eyes were as sharp and kind as ever. "Annalise," he said, his voice warm, "my brilliant daughter, the terror of the skies." Annalise laughed, the sound genuine and free of the tension of the past week. "Hardly, Dad, just a stickler for the rules." They sat together as the sun began to set, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and pink. She told him the whole story, not in the dry, factual language of her official report, but as a daughter talking to her father. She spoke of the sting of the insult, the cold anger she had felt, and the quiet resolve that had guided her actions. He listened without interruption, his hand resting on hers. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the mountains. "When I was a young man, not much older than you are now," he began softly, "I was denied service at a lunch counter in my own country. I stood there in my army uniform, having served a nation that still saw me as less than whole. I made a scene. I yelled, and I was thrown out. I felt righteous in my anger, but it changed nothing that day." He squeezed her hand. "You, Annalise, you did something different. You felt the same fire, I have no doubt, but you channeled it. You did not use anger. You used the law. You did not use emotion. You used procedure. I am proud of you, not for the power you wielded, but for the grace and discipline with which you wielded it. You did not stoop to her level. You rose above it and forced the system to work as it should. That is who you are. That is who your mother and I raised you to be." In that moment, Annalise felt the last vestiges of the incident's emotional weight lift from her shoulders. Her father's words crystallized the meaning of what had happened. It was not a story of revenge. It was a story of accountability, a continuation of a long, generational struggle, fought now not with protests, but with procedure and the unassailable weight of the law. She looked out at the new horizon, a vast expanse of mountains and sky, serene and silent. The world was still imperfect, the journey for equality far from over. But for one airline, for one flight crew, and for the countless passengers who would now benefit from improved training and oversight, a small piece of that world had been made demonstrably better. A standard had been upheld. And Dr. Annalise Sterling, FAA Aviation Safety Inspector, a daughter visiting her father in the quiet of the Alps, felt a profound sense of peace. She was a guardian of the skies in more ways than one, tasked not only with protecting the integrity of the machines, but also the dignity of the people who flew within them. This was more than just a viral moment of karma. It was a powerful reminder that our systems of justice and regulation, while imperfect, can and do work when wielded by those with integrity and courage. Dr. Annalise Sterling didn't just win an argument. She enforced the law and triggered systemic change within a massive corporation, making air travel safer and more equitable for everyone. Her story proves that one person, armed with professionalism and an unwavering commitment to what is right, can hold even the most powerful entities accountable. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of accountability and standing up against prejudice in all its forms, please help us share it. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with your friends and family to spread the message. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true stories of justice, karma, and incredible individuals who refuse to be silenced. Thank you for listening.